Hi, my name is David Kelsey, and I'm going to give today a lecture on George Berkeley. George Berkeley was famously an empiricist, and empiricists, what they believe is that knowledge is obtained through sense experience. This is opposed to the rationalist belief that knowledge is obtained through the mind. And Berkeley, like René Descartes, aims to refute global skepticism. Now, if you remember the global skeptic, what he does, at least for Descartes, what he does is he asserts the existence, Descartes asserts the existence of an evil demon. And he gives us this argument that, suppose there's this evil demon, and in that case, knowledge, as we know it, would be impossible. So Berkeley gives us an answer to the evil demon argument as well, and he says that imagine that hypothetically the evil demon is real, the evil demon exists. In that case, you have to admit though, because the evil demon is supplying us with sense experience, that it's in a certain sense true, this idea of sense experience, right? It's not that we can say that the sense experience we're having is truly about some world that's external to us. On the other hand, what we can say though is that it's true that the sense experience we're having is what we're having. So if I'm sensing, for example, the sky a certain way or the sun a certain way, then it really is that way, right? There's no such thing as seeming to seem, right? Now, so that gives us some sense of truth, right? There's a truth in which we can know the sense experience we're having is the real sense experience that we're having. The problem, though, is connecting that sense experience to a reality that's wholly external to us. And this is the problem known as Berkeley's gap, right? And the way this goes is that I can know that my experiences are really like the way I'm having them, but I cannot know that there is an external reality that's really like the experience I'm having, right? So for example, I might right now be perceiving a door, but there's no way for me to know that my perception of the door really is like the door, or even if there's a door there at all. And this is because I only have direct access to the perception that I'm having. I don't have access to reality. Thus, for example, again, back to the door, I only have access really to my perception of the door, not to the door itself, right? And this is, Berkeley thinks that the way that we perceive reality, we have sense experience of the world, but this is mediated by some idea or perception in the mind, right? And so the gap that we're having here, Berkeley's gap, is between the perception we're having in our mind of reality and reality itself. And what Berkeley thinks that this gap is kind of like an impassable gap, and there's no way to bridge the gap, right? So what Berkeley says, right, Berkeley aims to close that gap, the gap between our perception of reality and reality. And Berkeley does it in a quite surprising way. What Berkeley says is that there is no reality external to my perception. There is just my perception. And so this is the view called idealism. Idealism says that the only kinds of things that exist are in the mind. And so there is no reality external to the mind. There's just the mind and the ideas that the mind has and the perceptions and so on. Berkeley argues that an external reality, a reality that exists independently of us, there is no such thing. There is no reality that exists independent of us. It does not exist. So all there are thoughts, ideas, and experiences. Mental events, right? Another way to think about what Berkeley says is that Berkeley thinks that the only things there can be are mental things, right? Another way to put it even further is to think that the only kind of existence there is relative to a mind, right? So the only kinds of things that can exist are in virtue of a perception by a mind. And if there's no mind to perceive something, there is nothing there, right? There's nothing that can exist without the mind. And this is what we call Berkeley's view called idealism. Idealism basically just says that a reality external to our minds is impossible. There is no such thing. And all there is the mind and the mind's perceptions and ideas and thoughts. And we say that idealism is a form of anti-realism. Anti-realism is opposed to the idea called realism. Realism is the view that there really is an external reality that exists independent of us, right? In a certain sense, what we say is that realism says that there is at least some of reality which exists independent of a mind, right? So anti-realism, on the other hand, says that all of reality is mind dependent. It exists in virtue of a mind, a perceiver, right? And so that's what idealism is. Idealism is a form of anti-realism. And so according to anti-realism, there's not one part of reality that exists independent of a mind, right? I think most folks, most of us would be realists about you know, a world independent of us, right? We say that, for example, when we leave the room is there independently of us, objectively in some sense, and so it's going to remain there after we exit. But not so according to Berkeley, right? Berkeley would say that if there's no one around to perceive the room, there is no room, right? We'll go ahead and we'll look at Berkeley's argument for his position, this idealist position, right? Of course, idealism itself seems pretty counterintuitive, right? It seems kind of counter to the most basic common sense position that, you know, reality is kind of there whether we are here or not, right? So what Berkeley does is he gives us an argument for idealism that comes in the form of two premises. The first premise says that there is nothing that is perceived or conceived except mental things. This is again called representationalism. We've already mentioned this briefly in this video, but the idea with representationalism is that when I'm looking, say, at a door, I don't actually directly perceive the door. What I directly perceive instead is a kind of mental copy, an idea or a representation of that door. So I have access only to my idea of the door, not the door itself. Secondly, the second premise that Berkeley gives us is he says that there is nothing which is not perceived or conceived. So nothing exists in the universe that is unperceived or unconceived. And this is just to say that for something to exist, it has to be perceived by a mind, right? And then lastly, what will follow then is that there's nothing except mental things, right? Which is his idealism. Idealism says that the only things that exist are dependent on a mind, right? Thoughts and ideas and mental events, right? To explain a little bit more premise one of Berkeley's argument, right? He says that the only things that can be perceived are mental things, which are ideas and perceptions, things that are in the mind. And if you think about what he's saying here, it actually seems kind of counterintuitive, right? What he's actually saying is when you are looking, say, at a door, right, you're not actually perceiving directly the door. You're just perceiving something in your mind, a copy, a representation of the door. Right? And it's a little weird to say that because, you know, say if I go up to a door and I knock on it and I hit it and I bang on it and stuff, I feel like I'm connecting with that door. But Berkeley says no. He says instead what you're perceiving, what you're connecting with is sort of an idea of the door, right? A mental representation of it. Berkeley justifies his first premise, which is called representationalism, which says that again, when we perceive something, we're not perceiving the object, but instead an idea or a mental representation of it. Berkeley justifies this premise with what's called his bucket experiment. So he says, Berkeley says, hypothetically, suppose that you have two buckets of water. One is hot and one is cold. Now imagine that you put your left hand, plunge your left hand into the cold water, and then your right hand into the hot bucket of water, right? Now imagine you leave your hands in there for several minutes, right? Then imagine a third bucket of water that's just plain warm, right? Not hot or cold either. And imagine that after a few minutes with your hands in both the cold and the warm, the hot bucket of water, that you put both into this kind of lukewarm water. Now, what Berkeley says is that what will happen is that sort of medium temperature water there will feel at the same time cold and hot, right? To the hand that was buried in the cold water, that sort of lukewarm water will feel hot. And to the hand that was buried in the hot water, that lukewarm water is going to feel cold. But then Berkeley says if it's the water that you're feeling, then that would mean that the water at the same time would be both hot and cold, which is a contradiction. Water can't be both hot and cold at the same time. So what Berkeley thinks follows from this is that instead what you're feeling is your perceptions of the water, right? We don't perceive the water, we perceive an idea or a copy or a perception of the water in our minds. Berkeley's second premise says that there's nothing which is not perceived or conceived. There's nothing which is not in the mind, right? And Berkeley, his basic, the sort of famous quote that he gives us is that to be is to be perceived. What Berkeley is kind of saying here is that the only kind of existence there is or could be is an existence that is relative to a perceiver. So the only kinds of things that can exist are relative to some mind, to some perceiver, right? So there is no abstract or objective notion of existence. There's just existence relative to a mind, right? Now, what Berkeley does to argue for this premise is he asks us to consider a thought experiment. Berkeley asks you, the reader, to try to imagine something that exists without being perceived or conceived, without being thought of. Is there any such a thing, right? And Berkeley thinks it's impossible. So he says, try to imagine something that's unthought of. But now, if you partake in that experiment, what happens is, for example, imagine that you consider a house or a tree off in the middle of some, kind of open plain with no one around to perceive it. A house or tree in the middle of nowhere. But then Berkeley points out the obvious fact that you are perceiving that house or tree. So that house or tree is in your mind, right? So Berkeley then says that there is nothing that exists without being perceived, because you just simply cannot find one, anything like that, right? Let's consider how Berkeley answers the skeptic. Remember, Berkeley asserts that an external reality, a reality that exists independent of the mind, is impossible, doesn't exist, right? There is no such thing. But now if you remember that the skeptic asks us, right, remember Descartes, he considered the possibility of an evil demon who's causing you to hallucinate all of reality. But now notice that according to Berkeley, there is no reality independent of the mind. So then, of course, what could we be deceived about on Berkeley's view? There's no external reality, so there's nothing for the evil demon to trick me about. Thus, if there were really an evil demon causing us to hallucinate, then that would just be reality. It wouldn't be an illusion or a trick, it just would be how things were. So, according to Berkeley then, skeptical scenarios are impossible because there's just simply nothing for us to be tricked about. Okay, so now if we take idealism for what it is, it looks like we have an objection, a kind of horrific objection to Berkeley's view that will arise pretty quickly, right? So Berkeley thinks that something exists only if it's perceived by a mind. But now imagine a situation in which, for example, you just simply walk out of a room. It seems to follow from Berkeley's view that when you exit the room and you're not perceiving it, it would just pop out of existence. And then, of course, when you walk back into the room and you're perceiving it again, poof, there it is again existing. So reality, right, or what we take reality to be, would be, in a certain sense, popping in and out of existence according to whether or not there's a mind to perceive it. But of course, this cannot be the case, right? Reality just doesn't work like that. In fact, Berkeley admits that the common sense intuition is that, when you leave the room, it's going to remain, right? Whether you're there to perceive it or not. So since we have this common sense intuition that reality sort of remains consistent, it doesn't cease to exist when we leave the room, for example. But also, since the only things that Berkeley admits that can exist are dependent on some perceiver, Berkeley thinks that it follows that this is a proof of God's existence, right? If the only things that can exist are dependent on a mind, and yet there seems to be a reality that exists independent of us in some sense, a reality that doesn't just disappear when we stop perceiving it, it follows then that there's a kind of omnipresent perceiver who's perceiving all of reality to sustain its existence, right? And so Berkeley asserts then that God must exist as this omnipresent perceiver. So Berkeley's view then is that God is omnipresent. He's kind of this omnipresent perceiver. He perceives everything at the same time, all the time. And it is God's perceiving everything all the time that keeps things, real things, this reality that we think, that we feel is external to us, from popping in and out of existence. God sustains reality independent of us. So our common sense intuition that things have a reality independent of our perceiving them, on Berkeley's view, is cast out as a reality they have as perceived by God. But the interesting thing, if you think about it then, what follows from Berkeley's view is that when we're walking around in what we take to be this reality that exists independent of us, what we're really doing is walking around in God's perceptions, in God's mind. So in a certain literal kind of sense, according to Berkeley, we are in God's world, in God's creation. God is perceiving our world into existence, into being at every moment. Okay, so to end our lecture on Berkeley then, I would like to talk briefly about one problem that has always struck me as sort of a dilemma for Berkeley, a real issue. So if we take Berkeley's view seriously and consider what he said from start to finish, we seem to be kind of in a little bit of a pickle here. So Berkeley says at the end of his story that reality, there is a reality that exists independent of us, and it's just sort of sustained by God's perceiving all of it at once, God's being omnipresent. But then it seems to follow from this that we're a bit back at square one with skepticism. And the reason is that it seems that what Berkeley said now is that there is a reality that exists external to us, but it's just a reality in God's mind. But then the problem is that we seem to have Berkeley's gap created once again. Because how is it that I can know that my perception of this reality external to me is like that reality? In other words, how can I know that my perception is as God's, right? And so Berkeley's gap seems to be recreated here, and the gap lies between my perception of say, the door, which is, in fact, God's perception of the door, right? And so we're left sort of back to square one, right? How can we know our perception is as God's? And right, how could we feel so presumptuous to think that it would be like God's, right? And so I feel like at the end of this, we're left wondering a bit whether skepticism has been refuted at all. Okay? All right, well, thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed this lecture on Berkeley, and we'll see you next time.